Hi, I'm Brian Jackson with itbusiness.ca. Back in September at Showcase Ontario, I had the opportunity to talk with Mark James from Adobe and David McDonald with eRamp. They were telling me about online accessibility. Soon, businesses are going to have to concern themselves with accessibility online on their websites, just like they do now with their physical locations. Here's what they had to say.
Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act is a law that came in 2005, and over the last couple of years, there have been sectors of the community that are having legislation put around them. So there's the customer service legislation, which has just become law. There's the information and technology communications sector, which will have a law. So anything that deals with communications with the public will be affected. And then there's building environment and other three others. So the whole deal with website accessibility is that it is here. It has come to Ontario, and companies, organizations, public sector, private sector are going to have to pay attention to accessibility in the future going forward, just the same way as if you have a restaurant, you want to be able to have a ramp on your curb in order to help people who are in a wheelchair to get into your building. So they're just basically saying that the new economy is on the web, and what are we going to do to make sure that there's a level playing field for people with disabilities? And so the government of Ontario is looking to the WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0, which just came out in December 11th, 2008, 2009, I should say. And no, 2008, sorry, in December 11th, 2008, and they're looking towards those guidelines as a kind of a framework to help organizations get up to speed with accessibility.
I'd just like to add that more and more government agencies are looking to expose their products, information, and services to the webs. And as businesses, as Dave mentions, transform to the web, the way that we think about accessibility has to be in line with the way that we've looked traditionally at security. So organizations need to put in place a strategic plan around how they're going to address the security requirement. And that planning actually has to start happening from now and not at the point that the legislation comes in place.
Mark and David told me what accessibility online means and what you'll have to accomplish with your website to make sure that everybody can understand it.
There's software, and there's several competitors that produce software that they call screen readers. It's text-to-speech. And it helps, so it just reads the web basically, but it also does a lot more than that. If the websites are designed properly, then the images have a little bit of code behind them to describe what's in the image. So there'll be a little bit of text in behind an image attached to the image inside the href that basically says, this is a picture of the moon or from the earth or whatever. So there's going to be all kinds of little tags in behind multimedia. In Web 2.0, you can make that accessible to people who are blind, basically by just attaching little tags to them and describing what the action is. And there's a new technology called ARIA, A-R-I-A, which is basically enabling the whole rich internet to be labeled for people who are blind, so that when they are using these screen readers, they'll actually be able to know what they're hitting. They're not just going to get some funny code readout when they hit some widget.
I just want to add to that when we think about accessibility, we also have to expand that to the visually impaired. So there are several techniques in terms of making sure we have a right contrast, background colors, using large fonts that can be applied. And tools today allow people to develop content in a way that it meets these guidelines.
They also gave me some great tips about how you can get started and some tools that you can find online to help you along the way.
In terms of web accessibility, there are tons of tools online that can help you. If you go to the w3.org, w3.org, just type in accessibility there. That's the W3C site, and you will get tons of information. Adobe has a fantastic resource of accessibility. If you go to adobe.com/accessibility, they can tell you an awful lot about how to make their products accessible. And Adobe has worked extremely hard in the last 10 years in order to get up to speed and to help create a level playing field for people with disabilities.
I just add to that I think key thing that's needed from the industry is to help simplify the process for users. The reality is that we're dealing with government agents that are trying to communicate effectively with their audiences. So the more that we can simplify that process, standardize the way that people communicate, the easier it's going to be for them to transform their existing information into an accessible format.
Now, there are some deadlines that you'll have to know for this. In fact, the public sector, this is already being enforced for them, and the private sector, they have a couple of years to get ready, but the time to act is now, according to Mark.
You have to really get on it fast. Now, right now, there's a customer service, legal, this is a law, it's a regulation now, and it is being administered under the AODA, so there is enforcement around it for the public sector beginning January 1st, 2010. So it's right around the corner for the public sector. The private sector will be another couple of years, and that'll be on the heels of the information and communications technology standard.
We're also looking at both, currently we're talking about external-facing information, but this legislation will eventually affect internal-facing information within these agencies. So, a couple things we need to think about is that if you think about what's happening in government agencies, one of the greatest producers of information, of documents and papers, with a philosophy of information anywhere at any time, consideration has to be made considering that the legislation backdates information 5 years, meaning any content created from 2007 on needs to be accessible. Organizations need to start planning from now how they're going to start to make that information accessible so that they can help meet these requirements.
So if you're not compliant, what are the risks? Here's what Mark and David had to say.
What you need to think about is the impact of when the legislation was in place and somebody goes to get access to that information. So, our advice to organizations is to be proactive in terms of how they go about responding to it. Clearly, the awareness of accessibility, and David's been in this industry for over 10 years. I've been working in this market for quite some time, and clearly what we're seeing is that there was greater awareness happening. There's a greater expectation for the user community. So I think the recommendation from our part is to be proactive rather than reactive.
And I think that, it probably will be a complaints-driven process. So what I've learned by watching in the U.S. what's happening with around legislation and stuff like that is that any organization that is just willing to be open to learning about this generally doesn't have any trouble whatsoever. They get a few people who are in the disability community to set up a focus group and help them to work towards it. And as long as they're making steps towards it, my experience with this is that organizations do not have trouble until they start saying, no, we're not going to do this. This is absolutely crazy or whatever. And then, then the complaints start coming in, and not only do they lose their customers who have disabilities, and that can be a large sector, but it's bad press too.